And kind of at the end there, you actually touched on what I wanted to ask you about next, is just some of the, I guess, more so common critiques or points put forward from theists to kind of get your opinion or how you would think naturalism supports or explains these things. And the one you touched on was qualia, which is kind of that like subjective, like character experience, these inner sensations, the redness of red, the taste of sweetness, that sort of thing. Do you think these are difficult to explain under naturalism? What is kind of, is it an interesting critique to you? Where do you fall on that?
So I actually don't think that it's a difficulty for naturalism at all, but it might be for some naturalists. So I think that experiences are just things that happen in your brain. And there's no problem about that. You're seeing something red is just having certain stuff happening in your brain. On that view, I think that I can give a full account of your experience without adding anything that you don't believe in. You believe that there are, I'm thinking theists, right? I'm talking to a theist. They believe that stuff happens in your brain and it's got some connection to your behavior. They just think, I mean, there are different versions here, but you might think that there's just a correlation between what's happening in your brain and your experiences, right? You're a kind of amalgam of physical stuff and mental stuff. That view just seems way more complicated to me than the view that says, no, your experiences are just the things going on in your brain. So some people might say, I deny that there are qualia because they define qualia as stuff that happens in the soul or that doesn't happen in the brain. But that's, in that sense, of course, I don't think that there are qualia, but in a different sense, I do. I think that there are experiences, and I think the way that we ordinarily talk about them is just fine. It's just that what they turn out to be is just stuff happening in your brain.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I think complex systems can do some pretty complex things, and it's cool, but I wouldn't ascribe that to magic. The other one that I hear a lot is around things like logic, knowledge, morality. I know, the tag argument, theists will usually say you need like divine grounding for these things, and we'll get into maybe like the tag argument later, but what are your thoughts on this from a naturalistic perspective? Like, how should we view these and talk about them?
So, I mean, there are different things to say about maths and logic and morality. Some people will want to give very different treatments of them, but I'm inclined to think that that a kind of sufficient thing to say about all of these is that you don't need any ontology, right? Any special ontology in order to explain what we know in these areas. So some people think, for example, for mathematics, that you need a realm of abstract objects for the maths to be about. I much prefer a nominalist approach, right? And so I don't think that that you need any extra ontology. It just happens that the truths of mathematics are necessary truths. Necessary truths are true no matter what. So in particular, they don't depend on any kind of ontology. And I want to say the same thing about logic, and more controversially, I want to say the same thing about morality. There are some truths, but the truths that there are necessary. We don't necessarily know all the necessary truths in connection with morality any more than our knowledge of mathematics is complete, but we do know some things. And the question that the kind of difficult question might be one about the epistemology here. How do we come to know these things? How do we come to know the moral truths? How do we come to know the mathematical truths? Well, we come to know the mathematical truths and the logical truths by way of proof, right? And that's not controversial. And if things are necessary in the right kind of way, then it shouldn't be surprising that there are proofs connected with them. In morality, it's a bit different. We don't exactly have proofs, but it does seem to me that there are lots of cases where we can say, what's the alternative, right?
Hmm.
So suppose I say, and so I'm asking for your opinion. Do you think that it's wrong to torture infants for your own enjoyment? You're
Yes.
probably going to just say yes.
Mhm.
And you're probably going to think that, that more or less everybody's going to agree. And the reason why they're going to agree, I think, is because this claim is just true. And I'm inclined to think that it's necessarily true. You give me an alternative. How else, what else could the answer be,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't seem like it's contingent on anything. It just seems right. So that's my view. I admit that this is controversial. I'm not a moral philosopher, and you might, and including naturalist philosophers, will take different views here. So I'm not saying naturalists have to give this answer, but that's the answer that I'm going to give.
I know, and I know when it comes to morality and philosophy, you'll get 100 different answers from 100 different philosophers. I always like asking people who are either, atheists or naturalists, however they describe themselves, because it's interesting. I typically I use like the argument from agency myself. So like it's always just interesting to hear different people's perspective. I do kind of want to switch over to, I guess, then some of the arguments that you do hear from theism. First, I guess before I get into any specific ones, to be fair to theists, what do you think is the strongest case or argument or whatnot for the belief in theism for people who are theists?
So I think the strongest case is going to be a kind of cumulative case, like the one that I've made for naturalism. You just think that the answer comes out differently. So an example of something that comes slightly close to this would be Swinburne's approach. So Swinburne has this book. So Richard Swinburne has this book, The Existence of God, that he published in the 70s, in which he sets out a Bayesian argument where he says that the prior probability of God's not that low. And then there are all these bits of evidence that gradually build up the probability that theism is true until it hits something like 97% or something. I can't remember exactly the details.
Mhm.
Now, something like that argument is going to be the best argument because it draws on a wide range of evidence. I mean, Swinburne thought that his argument was incorporating all of the significant evidence. I doubt that many people now think that that's right, but it's the style of argument that,
Mhm.
or maybe it's not quite right to call it an argument. It's kind of the style of making a case that seems to me the right way to go.
Yeah, I agree because it feels more empirical that way, and I think there's a larger kind of group of people you can bring in. The first argument that I was very interested in getting your opinion on is like the first cause argument, kind of specifically the Kalam cosmological argument. For I guess those that might not be as familiar, it's that things that begin need a cause. The universe began to exist, thus it needs a cause. And then it kind of goes on. I'm paraphrasing here about that cause needs to be timeless, spaceless, and that's God. So therefore, God. What? And if you want to lay that out clearer, you can feel free because again, I was paraphrasing. But where do you think that sort of fails, or if not fail, then why doesn't it match up to kind of the naturalistic explanations you could give?
Okay, so there's a lot to say here. Your paraphrase was fine. We can run with that.
Mhm.
So there's one premise in the arguments that says that I'm going to. So we'll talk about the universe, right? What we mean is just the entirety of natural reality, whatever that is, the kind of causal web that we're embedded in. Um, that's amenable to description, at least in principle, by the sciences. So the whole domain that's studied by physicists, chemists, biologists, and all the rest. Okay, so natural reality has a beginning. That's one of the premises. And the other premise is that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist. Okay. Um, should we accept both of these claims together? Well, think about something slightly different. Suppose that instead of talking about natural reality, I just talk about reality.
Mhm.
Okay, the whole of causal reality, right? So naturalists and theists are going to disagree about the extent of this domain, but we agree that there is such a domain. Okay, so two questions. First question, does it begin to exist? So is there a beginning to causal reality? Second question, does everything that begins to exist have a cause? If you think that causal reality begins to exist, you can't think that it has a cause because the cause would be prior, and yet causal reality was supposed to be the entirety of causal reality. So you can't think that these two premises are true if we're talking about causal reality. And naturalists just think that causal reality is natural reality. So naturalists can't possibly think that premises are true, right? We have to reject one of them. And this shouldn't be mysterious to theists because they can't accept the corresponding argument fleshed out in terms of causal reality. So what are they going to say? So let's go back to the theists. What can they say? They may want to accept that causal reality began to exist. And typically they do. They think there's a first causing, right? God says something and other stuff appears. So they think that causal reality has a beginning, but then they can't think that everything that begins to exist has a cause. They can't think that there's a cause for that initial causing. They have to deny that. So what are they going to say instead? Well, typically what they say about the first cause, the first causing, is that it's necessary, right? Because if it was contingent, it'd need an explanation. It looks like it would need a causal explanation, but it can't have one. So they're going to say it's necessary. And so there's the kind of theistic response to the version of the Kalam argument couched in terms of causal reality. Mm-hmm. So what should naturalists say? Well, here's one thing they can say. Natural reality, the initial state of natural reality, the first causing, is necessary, right? Why not? Why not say that, right? If it's good enough for the theist to say it, surely it's good enough for the naturalist to say it too. And now the Kalam cosmological argument is just defanged.